pilots are trained to handle almost every possible emergency. But what happens when they face an issue that isn't fully covered in their handbook? This is exactly what happened to the crew of a Vueling Airbus A320 flying from Barcelona to Seville. During the flight, a serious issue arose, a malfunction in the nose wheel. The pilots had to rely on their skills and training to make quick decisions that could affect the safety of the 157 people on board. This story highlights how people perform under pressure and emphasizes the importance of continuous problem solving, especially in an era where reliance on automated systems is increasing. The story revolves around a Vueling flight from Barcelona, Spain, to Seville. When 150 passengers boarded the Airbus A320 operated by Spain's low-cost airline Vueling, they were expecting a short, one-hour flight southwest to Seville. Many of the passengers were tourists heading to the historic Andalusian city, while others were returning home after work or study in Barcelona or visiting family. In the cockpit, there were 3 pilots, a captain and 2 co-pilots. It was the crew's third flight of the day, having already flown to Rome and back. The captain, a 47-year-old Frenchman, had over 10,000 flight hours of experience. He was also highly familiar with the Airbus A320, with over 4,000 hours on this specific aircraft. On this flight, the captain was training a new first officer. This new first officer, a 42-year-old Spaniard, had less than 300 total flight hours, of which only 90 hours were on the A320. In fact, most of his experience on the A320 had been built up in just the previous 30 days. Due to his limited experience, a third pilot was also part of the crew, seated in the jump seat. This 33-year-old backup pilot had nearly 6,000 hours of flight experience, more than half of which were on the A320. He had also worked as a test pilot for 2 previous airlines. Around 7 p.m., Flight 2220 pushed back from Gate 1 at Barcelona's Terminal 1, and the pilots began taxiing to the runway. The sun was shining in northeastern Spain, and weather conditions were ideal for the flight. The pilots did not expect any issues, although the workload was higher due to the training of the new first officer. Shortly after 7 p.m., the aircraft reached the hold short point on the runway, and air traffic control gave them clearance for takeoff. On the ground, pilots used the tiller, rather than the rudder, to control the nose wheel. The captain aligned the nose wheel and set the engines to takeoff thrust. From this point, the plane was controlled using the side stick, thrust levers, and rudder pedals. Moments later, the aircraft lifted off the ground and headed southwest toward Seville. The first 25 minutes of the flight were uneventful. The aircraft quickly reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and the cabin crew began serving food and drinks. This aircraft was the oldest in Vueling's fleet. Built in 1990, it was 21 years old. Due to its age, the cockpit's jump seat was uncomfortable, so once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the backup first officer left the cockpit and sat in a passenger seat. However, 29 minutes later, Flight 2220 encountered its first issue of the day. The amber master caution light illuminated in the cockpit, and a fault message appeared on the ECM, Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor. Moments later, the captain's primary flight display, PFD, shut down. As the pilots were responding to this, another fault message appeared, indicating that the nose wheel steering system had failed. A few moments later, the captain's PFD came back online, but the fault message for the nose wheel steering remained. At this point, the pilots had to assess the seriousness of the issue. The captain recalled seeing a note in the aircraft's technical logbook earlier that day, which mentioned a prior issue with the nose wheel. Engineers had worked on it, but it appeared the issue had returned. In the Airbus A320, when the nose-wheel steering system fails, the wheel locks at a 90-degree angle. While this may seem odd, it is done to ensure the aircraft remains stable during landing. Without this mechanism, the wheel could freely rotate, causing the aircraft to veer off the runway. However, this system is not a perfect solution and can still present landing challenges. The captain decided to continue the flight to Seville, as it was a large airport nearby. He called the backup first officer back to the cockpit to support the more experienced co-pilot. The backup first officer reviewed the minimum equipment list, MEL, and flight crew operating manual, SCM, but he found no instructions on how to resolve the issue. The pilots decided to prepare for landing at Seville Airport's runway 27. They contacted air traffic control and declared a pan emergency. This call signals that a serious issue exists, but does not require immediate emergency action like a mayday call. As the aircraft approached the runway, the pilots lowered the landing gear. 3 green lights confirmed that the gear was fully locked. However, when the pilots configured the flight controls for landing, the autopilot, autothrust, and flight director suddenly disconnected, forcing the captain to take manual control of the aircraft. The challenge now lay in landing the plane with the nose wheel locked at a 90-degree angle. The captain skillfully landed the aircraft on the runway, ensuring the safety of all 150 passengers on board. This incident demonstrated the critical importance of experience and sound decision-making under pressure.